The drive was spoiled by a curious incident. While they followed the coast road in the direction of Les Noctambules, Bond described to her his wild chase in the Bentley, finally pointing out the curve he had taken before the crash, in the exact place where the vicious carpet of spikes had been laid. He slowed the car down and leant out to show her the deep cuts in the tarmac made by the rims of the wheels, and the broken branches in the hedge, and the patch of oil where the car had come to rest. But, all the time, she was distrait and fidgety, and commented only in monosyllables. Once or twice he caught her glancing in the driving mirror, but when he had a chance to look back through the rear window, they had just rounded a bend, and he could see, "This road is full of ghosts." Under cover of a short laugh, she looked back again. "Look!" There was an edge of panic in her voice. Obediently, Bond turned his head. Sure enough, a quarter of a mile away, a black saloon was coming after them at a good pace. Bond laughed. "We can't be the only people using this road," he said. "Anyway, who wants to follow us? We've done nothing wrong." He patted her hand. It's a middle-aged commercial traveler in car polish on his way to Le Havre. He's probably thinking of his lunch and his mistress in Paris. Really, Vesper, you mustn't think evil of the innocent." "I expect you're right," she said nervously. "Anyway, we're nearly there." She relapsed into silence and gazed out of the window. Bond could still feel her tenseness. He smiled to himself at what he took to be simply a hangover from their recent adventures. He decided to humor her, and when they came to a small lane leading towards the sea and slowed to turn down it, he told the driver to stop directly. They were off the main road. Hidden by the tall hedge, they watched together through the rear window. Through the quiet hum of summer noises, they could hear the car approaching. Vesper dug her fingers into his arm. The pace of the car did not alter as it approached their hiding place, and they had only a brief glimpse of a man's profile as a black saloon tore by. It was true that he seemed to glance quickly towards them, but above them in the hedge there was a gaily painted sign, point down the lane, announcing Les Aubroges des Fruits Défendus, Crustacés Fruitores. I don't speak French. Note of the day and every day. It was obvious to Bond that it was this that had caught the driver's eye. As the rattle of the car's exhaust diminished down the road, Vesper sank back into her corner. Her face was pale. He looked at us," she said. "I told you so. I knew we were being followed. Now they know where we are." Bond could not contain his impatience. "Bunkum. He was looking at that sign." He pointed it out to Vesper. She looked slightly relieved. "Do you really think so?" she asked. "Yes. Of course, you must be right. Come on. I'm sorry to be so stupid. I don't know what came over me." She leaned forward and talked to the driver through the partition, and the car moved on. She sank back and turned a bright face towards Bond. The color had almost come back to her cheeks. "I really am sorry. It's that I can't believe everything's over and there's no one to be frightened of anymore." She pressed his hand. "You must think me very stupid." Forward. Animation was back in her face, and the incident left only the smallest question mark hanging in the air. Even that faded as they came through the dunes and saw the sea in the modest little inn amongst the pines. "It's not very grand, I'm afraid," said Vesper, "but it's very clean, and the food's wonderful." She looked at him anxiously. She need not have worried. Bond loved the place at first sight. The terrace leading almost to the high tide mark, the low two-storied house was gay, bricked, awnings over the windows, and the crescent-shaped bay of blue water and golden sand. How many times in his life would he have given anything to have turned off a main road to find a lost corner like this, where he could let the world go by and live on in the sea from dawn to dusk? And now he was to have a whole week of this, and a Vesper. In his mind, he fingered the necklace of the days to come. They drew up in the courtyard behind the house, and the proprietor and his wife came out to greet them. Monsieur Vissois was a middle-aged man with one arm. The other he had lost fighting with the Free French in Madagascar. He was a friend of the chief of police of Royale, and it was the commissaire who had suggested the place to Vesper and had spoken to the proprietor on the telephone. As a result, nothing was going to be too good for them. Madame Vissois had been interrupted in the middle of preparing dinner. She wore an apron and held a wooden spoon in one hand. She was younger than her husband, chubby and handsome and warm-eyed. Instinctively, Bond guessed that they had no children, and that they gave their thwarted affection to their friends and some regular customers, and probably to some pets. He thought that their life was probably something of a struggle, and that the inn must be very lonely in wintertime with the big seas and the noise of the wind in the pines. The proprietor showed them to their rooms. Vesper's was a double room, and Bond was next door, at the corner of the house, with one window looking out to the sea, and another with a view of the distant arm of the bay. There was a bathroom between them. Everything was spotless and sparsely comfortable. The proprietor was pleased when they both showed their delight. He said that dinner would be at 7:30, and that Madame le Patron was preparing broiled lobsters with melted butter. He was sorry that they were so quiet just then. It was Tuesday. There would be more people at the weekend. The season had not been good. Generally, they had plenty of English people staying, but times were difficult over there, and the English just came for a weekend at Royale, and then went home after losing their money at the casino. It was not like the old days. He shrugged his shoulders philosophically, but then no day was like the day before, and no century like the previous one. And, quite so, said Bond. The end of chapter 22. All right. Chapter 23. Tide of Passion. They were talking on the threshold of Vesper's room when the proprietor left them. Bond pushed her inside the closed door. Then he put his hands on her shoulders, and he kissed her on both cheeks. "This is heaven," he said. Then he saw that her eyes were shining. Her hands came up and rested on his forearms. He stepped right up against her, and his arms dropped around her waist. Her head went back, and her mouth opened beneath his. "My darling," he said. He plunged his mouth down over hers and felt her respond, shyly at first, then more passionately. His hand slipped down her back and pressed her body fiercely to his. Panting, she slipped her mouth away, and they clung together. He brushed her ear with his lips and felt the firm warmth of her breasts against him. I'm going to make an aside here. I had put up a thing before I started this book about what book I should read, and a friend of mine jokingly responded, 50 Shades of Grey, and now I feel like that's exactly what I'm reading. Yes, then he reached up and seized her hair and bent her head back until he could kiss her again. She pushed him away and sank back, exhausted, on the bed. For a moment, they looked at each other, hungrily. I'm sorry, Vesper, he said. I didn't mean to then. She shook her head, dumb with storm which had passed through her. He came and sat beside her, and they looked at each other with lingering tenderness as the tide of passion ebbed in their veins. She leant over and kissed him on the corner of the mouth. Then she brushed the black comma of hair back from his damp forehead. My darling, she said, give me a cigarette. I don't know where my bag is. She looked vaguely round the room. Bond lit one for her and put it between her lips. She took a deep lungful of smoke and let it pour out through her mouth with a slow sigh. Bond put his arm around her, but she got up and walked over to the window. She stood there with her back to him. Bond looked down at his hands and saw they were still trembling. It's going to take some time to get ready for dinner, said Vesper, still not looking at him. Why don't you go and bathe? I'll unpack for you. Bond left the bed and came and stood close against her. He put his arms around her and put a hand over her each breast. They filled his hands, and the nipples were hard against his fingers. She put her hands over his and pressed them into her, but she still looked away from him, out the window. Not now, she said in a low voice. Bond bent and burrowed his lips into the nape of her neck. For a moment he strained her hard to him. Then he let her go. All right, Vesper, he said. He walked over to the door and looked back. She had not moved. For some reason, he thought she was crying. He took a step towards her and then realized that there was nothing to say between them then. My love, he said. Then he went out and shut the door. Bond walked along to his room and sat down on the bed. He felt weak from the passion which had swept through his body. He was torn between the desire to fall back full length on the bed and his longing to be cooled and revived by the sea. He played with the choice for a moment, then he went over to his suitcase and took out white linen bathing trunks and a dark blue pajama suit. Bond had always disliked pajamas and had slept naked until in Hong Kong at the end of the war became across the perfect compromise. This was a pajama coat, which came almost down to the knees. It had no buttons, but there was a loose belt around the waist. The sleeves were wide and short, ending just above the elbow. The result was cool and comfortable, and now, when he slipped the coat on over his trunks, all his bruises and scars were hidden, except the thin white bracelets on wrists and ankles, and the mark of smirch on his right hand. He slipped his feet into the pair of dark blue leather sandals, and went downstairs and out of the house, and across the terrace to the beach. As he passed across the front of the house, he thought of Vesper, but he refrained from looking up to see if she was still standing at the window. If she saw him, she gave no sign. He walked along the waterline on the hard golden sand until he was out of sight. Then he threw off his pajama coat and took a short run and a quick flat dive into the small waves. The beach shelved quickly, and he kept under water as long as he could, swimming with powerful strokes and feeling the soft coolness all over him. Then he surfaced and brushed the hair out of his eyes. He was nearly 7, and the sun had lost much of its heat. Before long, it would sink beneath the further arm of the bay, but now it was straight in his eyes, and he turned on his back and swam away from it, so that he could keep it with him as long as possible. When he came ashore nearly a mile down the bay, the shadows had already engulfed his distant pajamas, but he knew he had time to lie on the hard sand and dry before the tide of dusk reached him. He took off his bathing trunks and looked down at his body. There were only a few traces left of his injuries. He shrugged his shoulders and lay down with his limbs spread out in the star and gazed up at the empty blue sky and thought of Vesper. His feelings for her were confused, and he was impatient with the confusion. They had been so simple. He had intended to sleep with her as soon as he could, because he desired her, and also because he admitted to himself he wanted coldly to put the repairs to his body to the final test. He thought they would sleep together for a few days, and then he might see something of her in London. Then would come the inevitable disengagement, and would be all the easier because of their positions in the service. If it was not easy, he could go off on an assignment abroad, or, which was also in his mind, he could resign and travel to different parts of the world as he had always wanted. But somehow she had crept under his skin, and over the last 2 weeks, his feelings had gradually changed. He found her companionship easy and unexacting. There was something enigmatic about her which was a constant stimulus. She gave little of her real personality away, and he felt that, however long they were together, there would always be a private room inside her which he could never invade. She was thoughtful and full of consideration without being slavish and without compromising her arrogant spirit. And now he knew that she was profoundly, excitingly sensual, but that the conquest of her body, because of the central privacy in her, would each time have the tang of rape. Loving her physically would each time be a thrilling voyage without the anticlimax of arrival. She would surrender herself vividly, he thought, and greedily enjoy all the intimacies of the bed without ever allowing herself to be possessed. Naked, Bond lay and tried to push away the conclusions he read in the sky. He turned his head and looked down the beach and saw that the shadows of the headland were almost reaching for him. He stood up and brushed off as much of the sand as he could reach. He reflected that he would have a bath when he got in, and he absent-mindedly picked up his trunks and started walking back along the beach. It was only when he reached his pajama coat and bent to pick it up that he realized he was still naked. Without bothering about the trunks, he slipped on the light coat and walked on to the hotel. At this moment, his mind was made up. The conclusion of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Fruit défendu. When he got back to his room, he was touched to find all his belongings put away, and in the bathroom, his toothbrush and shaving things neatly arranged at one essence on the chair beside it with his towel. "Vesper," he called. "Yes?" "You really are the limit. You make me feel like an expensive gigolo." "I was told to look after you. I'm only doing what I was told." "Darling, the bath's absolutely right. Will you marry me?" She snorted. "You need a slave, not a wife." "I want you." "Well, I want my lobster and champagne, so hurry up." All right, said Bond. And with that, let me flip over the record, and we'll continue. I chose music that is way too intense for the bathing and relaxing that's been happening so far. But who knows? Maybe it'll work out. Uh, where were we? Yes. All right, said Bond. He dried himself and dressed in a white shirt and dark blue slacks. He hoped that she would be dressed as simply, and he was pleased when, without knocking, she appeared in the doorway, wearing a blue linen shirt, which had faded to the color of her eyes, and a dark red skirt in pleated cotton. I couldn't wait. I was famished. My room's over the kitchen, and I've been tortured by the wonderful smells. He came over and put his arm around her. She took his hand, and together they went downstairs and out onto the terrace, where their table had been laid in the light cast by the empty dining room. The champagne which Bond had ordered on their arrival stood in a plated wine cooler beside their table, and Bond poured out 2 full glasses. Vesper busied herself with a delicious homemade liver pâté and helped them both to the crisp French bread and the thick squares of deep yellow butter set in chips of ice. They looked at each other and drank deeply, and Bond filled their glasses again to the rim. While they ate, Bond told her of his bathe, and they talked of what they would do in the morning. All through the meal they left unspoken their feelings for each other, but in Vesper's eyes, as much as in Bond's, there was excited anticipation of the night. They let their hands and feet touch from time to time, as if to ease the tension in their bodies. When the lobster had come and gone through the second bottle of champagne, when the lobster had come and gone, and the second bottle of champagne was half empty, and they had just ladled back thick cream over their frosé de bois. Now I'm sorry to cooks and chefs and French people. Vesper gave a deep sigh of contentment. "I'm behaving like a pig," she said happily. "You always give me all the things I like best. I've never been so spoiled before." She gazed across the terrace at the moonlit bay. "I wish I deserved it." Her voice had a wry undertone. "Well, what do you mean?" asked Bond, surprised. "Oh, I don't know. I suppose people get what they deserve, so perhaps I do deserve it." She looked at him and smiled. Her eyes narrowed quizzically. "You really don't know much about me," she said suddenly. Bond was surprised by the undertones of seriousness in her voice. "Quite enough," he said, laughing. "All I need until tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. You don't know much about me, for that matter." He poured out more champagne. Vesper looked at him thoughtfully. "People are islands," she said. "They don't really touch. However close they are, they're really quite separate, even if they've been married for 50 years. Bond thought with dismay that she might be giving in a vin triste. Too much champagne had made her melancholy, but suddenly she gave a happy laugh. "Don't look so worried." She leaned forward and put her hand over his. "I was only being sentimental. Anyway, my island feels very close to your island tonight." She took a sip of champagne. Bond laughed, relieved. "Let's join up and make a peninsula," he said. "Now directly we've finished the strawberries." "No," she said, flirting. "I must have coffee." "And brandy?" countered Bond. The small shadow had passed. The second small shadow. This too left a tiny question mark hanging in the air. It quickly dissolved as warmth and intimacy enclosed them again. When they had had their coffee and Bond was sipping his brandy, Vesper picked up her bag and came and stood behind him. "I'm tired," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. He reached up and held it there, and they stayed motionless for a moment. She bent down and lightly brushed his hair with her lips. Then she was gone, and a few seconds later, the light came on in her room. Bond smoked and waited until it had gone out. Then he followed her, pausing only to say good night to the proprietor and his wife, and thank them for the dinner. They exchanged compliments, and he went upstairs. It was only 9:30 when he stepped into her room from the bathroom and closed the door behind him. The moonlight shone through the half-closed shutters and lapped at the secret shadows in the snow of her body on the broad bed. Pardon me. Bond awoke in his own room at dawn, and for a time he lay and stroked his memories. Then he got quietly out of bed, and in his pajama coat he crept past Vesper's door and out of the house to the beach. The sea was smooth and quiet in the sunrise. The small pink waves idly licked the sand. It was cold, but he took off his jacket and wandered naked along the edge of the sea, to the point where he had bathed the evening before. Then he walked slowly and deliberately into the water until it was just below his chin. He took his feet off the bottom and sank, holding his nose with one hand and shutting his eyes, feeling the cold water comb his body and his hair. The mirror of the bay was unbroken except for where it seemed fish had jumped. Under the water he imagined the tranquil scene and wished that Vesper could just then come through the pines and be astonished to see him suddenly erupt from the empty seascape. When after a full minute he came to the surface in a froth of spray, he was disappointed. There was no one in sight. For a time he swam and drifted, and then, when the sun seemed to be hot enough, he came into the beach and lay on his back and reveled in the body which the night had given back to him. As on the evening before, he stared into the empty sky and saw the same answer there. After a while he rose and walked back slowly along the beach to his pajama coat. That day he would ask Vesper to marry him. He was quite certain. It was only a question of choosing the right moment. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Black Patch. As he walked quietly from the terrace into the half-darkness of the still-shuttered dining room, he was surprised to see Vesper emerge from the glass-fronted telephone booth near the front door and softly turn up the stairs towards their rooms. "Vesper," he called, thinking she must have had some urgent message which might concern them both. She turned quickly, a hand up to her mouth. For a moment longer than necessary, she stared at him, her eyes wide. "What is it, darling?" he asked, vaguely troubled and fearing some crisis in their lives. "Oh," she said breathlessly, "you made me jump. It was only... I was just telephoning to Mathis." "To Mathis," she repeated. "I wondered if he could get me another frock. You know, from that girlfriend I told you about. The vendeuse. You see, she talked quickly, her words coming out in a persuasive jumble. I've really got nothing to wear. I thought I'd catch him at home before he went to the office. And I don't know my friend's telephone number, and I thought it would be a surprise for you. I don't want you to hear me moving and wake you up. Is the water nice? Have you bathed? You ought to have waited for me." "It's wonderful," said Bond, deciding to relieve her mind, though irritated with her obvious guilt over this childish mystery. "You must go in, and then we'll have breakfast on the terrace." "I'm ravenous. I'm sorry I made you jump. I was just startled to see anyone about at this hour of the morning." He put his arm around her, but she disengaged herself and moved quickly on up the stairs. "It was such a surprise to see you," she said, trying to cover the incident up with a light touch. "You looked like a ghost, a drowned man, with the hair down over your eyes like that." She laughed harshly. Hearing the harshness, she turned the laugh into a cough. I hope I haven't caught cold," she said. She kept on patching up the edifice of her deceit until Bond wanted to spank her and tell her to relax and tell the truth. Instead, he just gave her a reassuring pat on the back outside her room and told her to hurry up and have her bath. Then he went on to his room. That was the end of the integrity of their love. The succeeding days were a shambles of falseness and hypocrisy, mingled with her tears and moments of animal passion, to which she abandoned herself with greed made indecent by the hollowness of their days. Several times Bond tried to break down the dreadful walls of mistrust. Again and again he brought up the subject of the telephone call, but she obstinately bolstered up her story with embellishments, which Bond knew she had thought about afterwards. She even accused Bond of thinking she had another lover. These scenes always ended in her bitter tears, in moments of hysteria. Each day the atmosphere became more hateful. It seemed fantastic to Bond that human relationships could collapse into dust overnight, and he searched his mind again and again for a reason. He felt that Vesper was just as horrified as he was, and if anything, her misery seemed greater than his. But the mystery of the telephone conversation, in which Vesper angrily, almost fearfully, it seemed to Bond, refused to explain with a shadow which grew darker with other small mysteries and reticencies. Already at luncheon on that day things got worse. After a breakfast, which was an effort for both of them, Vesper said she had had a headache and would stay in her room, out of the sun. Bond took a book and walked for miles down the beach. By the time he returned, he had argued to himself that they would be able to sort the problem out over lunch. Directly, they sat down. He apologized gaily for having startled her at the telephone booth, and then he dismissed the subject and went on to describe what he had seen on his walk. But Vesper was distrait and commented only in monosyllables. She toyed with her food, and she avoided Bond's eyes and gazed past him with an air of preoccupation. When she had failed once or twice to respond to some conversational gambit or other, Bond also relapsed into silence and occupied himself with his own gloomy thoughts. All of a sudden she stiffened. Her fork fell with a clatter on the edge of her plate, and then noisily off the table onto the terrace. Bond looked up. She had gone as white as a sheet, and she was looking over his shoulder with terror in her face. I want to take another drink while we suspensefully wait to see what's caught her in terror. And the music is all of a sudden perfectly appropriate. Bond turned his head and saw that a man had just taken his place at a table on the opposite side of the terrace, well away from them. He seemed ordinary enough, perhaps rather somberly dressed, but in his first quick glance, Bond put him down as some businessman on his way along the coast who had just happened on the inn, or had picked it out of the Michelin. "What is it, darling?" he asked anxiously. Vesper's eyes never moved from the distant figure. It's the man in the car," she said in a stifled voice. "The man who is following us. I know it is." Bond looked again over his shoulder. The patron was discussing the menu with the new customer. It was a perfectly normal scene. They exchanged smiles over some item on the menu, and apparently agreed that it would suit for the patron, took the card, and with, Bond guessed, a final exchange about the wine, withdrew. The man seemed to realize that he was being watched. He looked up and gazed incuriously at them for a moment. Then he reached for a briefcase on the chair beside him, extracted a newspaper, and started to read it, his elbows propped up on the table. When the man had turned his face towards them, Bond noticed that he had a black patch over one eye. It was not tied with a tape across the eye, but screwed in like a monocle. Otherwise, he seemed a friendly middle-aged man, with dark brown hair brushed straight back, and as Bond had seen while he was talking to the patron, particularly large white teeth. He turned back to Vesper. "Really, darling, he looks very innocent. Are you sure he's the same man? We can't expect to have this place entirely to ourselves." Vesper's face was still a white mask. She was clutching the edge of the table in both hands. He thought she was going to faint and almost rose to come around to her, but she made a gesture to stop him. Then she reached for a glass of wine and took a deep draught. The glass rattled on her teeth, and she brought up her other hands to help. Then she put the glass down. She looked at him with dull eyes. "I know it's the same." He tried to reason with her, but she paid no attention. After glancing over her twice over his shoulder with eyes that held a curious submissiveness, she said that her headache was still bad and that she would spend the afternoon in her room. She left the table and walked indoors without a backward glance. Bond was determined to set her mind at rest. He ordered coffee to be brought to the table. Then he rose and walked swiftly through the courtyard. The black Peugeot which stood there might indeed have been the saloon they had seen, but it might equally have been one of the million others on the French roads. He took a quick glance inside, but the interior was empty, and when he tried the boot, it was locked. He made a note of the Paris number plate, then went quickly to the lavatory adjoining the dining room, pulled the chain, and walked out on the terrace. The man was eating and didn't look up. Bond sat down in Vesper's chair so that he could watch the other table. A few minutes later, the man asked for the bill, paid it, and left. Bond heard the Peugeot start up, and soon the noise of its exhaust had disappeared in the direction of the road to Royale. When the patron came back to his table, Bond explained that Madame had unfortunately a slight touch of sunstroke. After the patron had expressed his regret and enlarged on the dangers of going out of doors in almost any weather, Bond casually asked about the other customer. "He reminds me of a friend who also lost an eye. They wear very similar eye patches." The patron answered that the man was a stranger. He had been pleased with his lunch and had said that he would be passing that way again in a day or two, and would take another meal at the Hubbardge. Apparently he was Swiss, which could also be seen from his accent. He was a traveler in watches. It was shocking to have only one eye. The strain of keeping that patch in place all day long. He supposed one got used to it. It is indeed very sad, said Bond. You also have been unlucky. He gestured to the proprietor's empty sleeve. I myself was very fortunate. For a time they talked about the war. Then Bond rose. I love all of the things that tie into World War II in both the James Bond stuff, that in the books anyway, obviously not the movies, but also I've been reading a lot of Indiana Jones books, and getting to obviously that series goes through World War One, and then I'm getting into one where it's kind of addressing World War II stuff. Anyway, for a time they talked about the war, and then Bond rose. By the way, he said, Madame had an early telephone call which I must remember to pay for. Paris Élysée number, I think, he added, remembering that this was Mathis's exchange. Thank you, monsieur, but the matter is regulated. I was speaking to Royale this morning, and the exchange mentioned that one of my guests had put through a call to Paris, and that there had been no answer. They wanted to know if Madame would like the call kept in. I'm afraid the matter escaped my mind. Perhaps monsieur would mention it to Madame? But let me see, it was in Invalidus number the exchange referred to. The end of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Sleep well, my darling. The next 2 days were much the same. On the 4th day of their stay, Vesper went off early to Royale. A taxi came and fetched her and brought her back. She said she needed some medicine. That night she made a special effort to be gay. She drank a lot, and when they went upstairs, she led him into her bedroom and made passionate love to him. Bond's body responded, but afterwards she cried bitterly into her pillow, and Bond went to his room in grim despair. He could hardly sleep, and in the early hours he heard her door open softly. Some small sounds came from downstairs. He was sure she was in the telephone booth. Very soon he heard her door softly close, and he guessed that again there had been no reply from Paris. This was Saturday. On Sunday, the man with the black patch was back. Bond knew it directly. He looked up from his lunch and saw her face. He had told her all that the patron had told him, withholding only the man's statement that he might be back. He had thought it would worry her. My record's over, but I'm going to take a chance and keep reading. I'm just going to go put it back at the beginning. The Instagram feed only goes for an hour, so when I see you cut off, I will end and we'll pick up tomorrow, if need be, if we don't get through the end. It's actually one of the reasons I keep my Instagram camera facing forward, so I can see when that happens. So sorry that your images are backwards. Okay, chapter 26. Sleep well, my darling. Oh, we got that far. That's right. The man with the black patch was back. He had told her everything except for the fact that he might be back. He had thought it might worry her. He had also telephoned Mathis in Paris and checked on the Peugeot. It had been hired from a respectable firm 2 weeks before. The customer had had a Swiss triptyque. His name was Adolf Gettler. What an unfortunate name. He had given a bank in Zurich as his address. Mathis had got on to the Swiss police. Yes, the bank had had an account in his name. It was little used. Herr Gettler was understood to be connected with the watch industry. Inquiries could be pursued if there was a charge against him. Vesper had shrugged her shoulders at the information. This time, when the man appeared, she left her lunch in the middle and went straight up to her room. Bond made up his mind. When he had finished, he followed her. Both her doors were locked, and when he made her let him in, he saw that she had been sitting in the shadows by her window, watching, he presumed. His face was of cold stone. He led her to the bed and drew her down beside him. They sat stiffly, like people in a railway carriage. Vesper, he said, holding her cold hands in his, we can't go on like this. We must finish with it. We are torturing each other, and there is only one way of stopping it. Either you must tell me what all this is about, or we must leave at once. She said nothing, and her hands were lifeless in his. My darling, he said, won't you tell me? Do you know that first morning I was coming back to ask you to marry me? Did you know? Can't we go back to the beginning again? What is this dreadful nightmare that is killing us? At first she said nothing. Then a tear rolled slowly down her cheek. You mean you would have married me? Bond nodded. Oh, my God, she cried. My God. She turned and clutched him, pressing her face against his chest. He held her closely to him. Tell me, my love, he said. Tell me what's hurting you. Her sobs became quieter. Leave me for a little, she said. A new note had come into her voice, a note of resignation. Let me think for a little. She kissed his face and held it between her hands. She looked at him with yearning. Darling, I'm trying to do what's best for us. Please believe me. But it's terrible. I'm in a frightful... She wept again, clutching him like a child with nightmares. He soothed her, stroking the long black hair and kissing her softly. Go away now, she said. I must have time to think. We've got to do something. She took his handkerchief and dried her eyes. She led him to the door, and there they held tightly to each other. Then he kissed her again, and she shut the door behind him. That evening, most of the gayness and intimacy of their first night came back. She was excited, and some of her laughter sounded brittle. But Bond was determined to fall in with her new mood, and it was only at the end of dinner that he made a passing remark which made her pause. She put her hands over his. Don't talk about it now, she said. Forget it now. It's all past. I'll tell you about it in the morning. She looked at him, and suddenly her eyes were full of tears. She found a handkerchief in her bag and dabbed at them. Give me some more champagne, she said. She gave a queer little laugh. I want a lot more. You drink much more than me. It's not fair. They sat and drank together. He drinks a lot more than anybody, according to this book. They sat and drank together until the bottle was finished. Then she got to her feet. She knocked against her chair and giggled. I do believe I'm tight, she said. How disgraceful. Please, James, don't be ashamed of me. I do so want to be gay. And I am gay. She stood behind him and ran her fingers through his black hair. Come up quickly, she said. She blew a kiss at him, and he was gone. For 2 hours they made slow, sweet love in a mood of happy passion, which the day before Bond would never have thought they would ever do again. The barriers of self-consciousness and mistrust seemed to have vanished. The words they spoke to each other were innocent and true again, and there was no shadow between them. You must go now, said Vesper, when Bond had slept for a while in her arms. As if to take back her words, she held him more closely to her, murmuring endearments and pressing her body down the whole length of his. When he finally rose and bent to smooth back her hair and finally kiss her eyes and her mouth good night, she reached out and turned on the light. Look at me, she said, and let me look at you. He knelt beside her. She examined every line of his face as if she were seeing him for the first time. Then she reached up and put an arm round his neck. Her deep blue eyes were swimming with tears as she drew his head slowly towards her and kissed him gently on the lips. Then she let him go and turned off the light. Good night, my dearest love, she said. Bond bent and kissed her. He tasted the tears on her cheek. He went to the door and looked back. Sleep well, my darling, he said. Don't worry, everything's all right now. He closed the door softly and walked to his room with a full heart. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27, The Bleeding Heart. The patron brought him the letter in the morning. He burst into Bond's room, holding the envelope in front of him, as if it were on fire. There's been a terrible accident. Madame... Bond hurled himself out of bed and through the bathroom, but the communicating door was locked. He dashed back and through his room and down the corridor past a shrinking, terrified maid. Vesper's door was open. The sunlight through the shutters lit up the room. Only her black hair showed above the sheet, and her body under the bedclothes was straight and molded like a stone effigy on a tomb. Bond fell on his knees beside her and threw back the sheet. She was asleep. She must be. Her eyes were closed. There was no change in the dear face. She was just as she would look, and yet she was so still. No movement, no pulse, no breath. That was it. There was no breath. Later, the patron came in and touched him on the shoulder. He pointed at the empty glass on the table beside her. There were white dregs in the bottom of it. It stood beside her book and her cigarettes and matches and the small, pathetic litter of her mirror and lipstick and handkerchief. And on the floor, the empty bottle of sleeping pills. The pills Bond had seen in the bathroom that first evening. Bond rose to his feet and shook himself. The patron was still holding out the letter towards him. He took it. "Please notify the commissaire," said Bond. "I will be in my room when he wants me." He walked blindly away without a backward glance. He sat on the edge of his bed and gazed out the window at the peaceful sea. Then he stared dully at the envelope. It was addressed simply in a large round hand. "Pour Lieu." The thought passed through Bond's mind that she must have left orders to be called early, so that he would not be the one to find her. He turned the envelope over. Not long ago, her warm tongue had sealed the flap. He gave a sudden shrug and opened it. It was not long after the first few words he read. He read it quickly, the breath coming harshly through his nostrils. Then he threw it down on the bed as if it had been a scorpion. And now the letter. "My darling James," the letter opened, "I love you with all my heart, and while you read these words, I hope you still love me, because now with these words, this is the last moment that your love will last. So goodbye, my sweet love, while we still love each other. Goodbye, my darling. I am an agent of the MWD. Yes, I am a double agent for the Russians. I was taken on a year after the war, and I have worked for them ever since. I was in love with a Pole in the RAF. Until you, I still was. I can find out who he was. He had 2 DSOs, and after the war, he was trained by M and dropped back into Poland. They caught him, and by torturing him, they found out a lot, and also about me. They came after me and told me he could live if I were to work for them. He knew nothing of this, but he was allowed to write to me. The letter arrived on the 15th of each month. I found I couldn't stop. I couldn't bear the idea of a 15th coming round without his letter. It would mean that I had killed him. I tried to give them as little as possible. You must believe me about this. Then it came to you. I told them you had been given this job at Royale, what your cover was, and so on. That is why they knew about you before you arrived, and why they had time to put the microphones in. They suspected Le Chiffre, but they didn't know what your assignment was, except that it was something to do with him. That was all I was told. Then I was told not to stand behind you in the casino, and to see that neither Mathis nor Leiter did. That was why the gunman was nearly able to shoot you. Then I had to stage that kidnapping. You may have wondered why I was so quiet in the nightclub. They didn't hurt me because I was working for the MWD. But when I found out what had been done to you, even though it was Le Chiffre who did it, and he turned out to be a traitor, I decided I couldn't go on. By the time I had begun to fall in love with you, they wanted me to find out things from you while you were recovering. But I refused. I was controlled from Paris. I had to ring up an invalid's number twice a day. They threatened me, and finally they withdrew my control, and I knew my lover in Poland would have to die. But they were afraid I would talk. I suppose I got a final warning that Smersh would come for me if I didn't obey them. I took no notice. I was in love with you. Then I saw the man with the black patch in the Splendide, and I found he had been making inquiries about my movements. This was the day before we came down here. I hoped I could shake him off. I decided that we would have an affair, and I would escape to South America from Le Havre. I hoped I would have a baby of yours and be able to start again somewhere. But they followed us. You can't get away from them. I knew it would be the end of our love if I told you. I realized that I could either wait to be killed by Smersh, and perhaps you get killed too, or I could kill myself. There it is, my darling love. You can't stop me calling you that, or saying that I love you. I'm taking that with me, in the memories of you. I can't tell you much to help you. The parents' number was Invalids 55200. I never met any of them in London. Everything was done through an accommodation address, and newsagents at 450 Charing Cross Place. At our first dinner together, you talked about that man in Yugoslavia who was found guilty of treason. He said, I was carried away by the gale of the world. That's my only excuse. That, for the love of a man whose life I tried to save. It's late now, and I'm tired, and you're just through 2 doors, but I've got to be brave. You might save my life, but I couldn't bear the look in your dear eyes. My love, V. Whew. Alright, we're gonna finish this. Bond threw the letter down. Mechanically, he brushed the fingers together. Suddenly, he banged his temples with his fists and stood up. For a moment, he looked towards the quiet sea. Then he cursed aloud, one harsh obscenity. His eyes were wet, and he dried them. He pulled on a shirt and trousers, and with a set, cold face, he walked down and shut himself in the telephone booth. While he was getting through to London, he calmly reviewed the facts of Vesper's letter. They all fit. The little shadows and question marks of the past 4 weeks, which his instinct had noted but his mind rejected, all stood out like signposts. He saw her now only as a spy. Their love and his grief was relegated to the box room of his mind. Later, perhaps, they would be dragged out, dispassionately examined, and then bitterly thrust back with other sentimental baggage he would rather forget. Now he could only think of her treachery to the service and to her country, and to the damage it had done. His professional mind was completely absorbed with the consequences, the covers which must have been blown over the years, the codes which the enemy must have broken, the secrets which must have been leaked from the center of the very section devoted to penetrating the Soviet Union. It was ghastly. God knew how the mess would be cleared up. He ground his teeth. Suddenly Mathis's words came back to him. There are plenty of really black targets around. And earlier, what about Smersh? I don't like the idea of these chaps running around France, killing anyone they feel has been a traitor to their precious political system. Bond grinned bitterly to himself. How soon Mathis had been proved right, and how soon his own little sophistries had been exploded in his face. While he, Bond, had been playing Red Indians through the years. Yes, Le Chiffre's description was perfectly accurate. The real enemy had been working quietly, coldly, without heroics, right there at his elbow. He suddenly had a vision of Vesper walking down a corridor with documents in her hand, on a tray. They just got it on a tray while the cool secret agent with a 00 number was gallivanting around the world, playing Red Indians. His fingernails dug into the palms of his hands, and his body sweated with shame. Well, it was not too late. Here was a target for him, right to hand. He would take on Smersh, and hunt it down. Without Smersh, without this cold weapon of death and revenge, the MWD would be just another bunch of civil servants and spies, no better and no worse than any of the Western services. Smersh was the spur. Be faithful, spy well, or you die. Inevitably, and without question, you will be hunted down and killed. It was the same with the whole Russian machine. Fear was the impulse. For them, it was always safer to advance than to retreat, advance against the enemy. And the bullet might miss you. Retreat, evade, betray, and the bullet would never miss. But now he would attack the arm that held the whip and the gun. The business of espionage would be left to the white-collar boys. They could spy and catch the spies. He would go after the threat behind the spies, the threat that made them spy. The telephone rang, and Bond snatched up the receiver. He was on to the Link, the outside liaison officer who was the only man in London he might telephone from abroad. Then, only in dire necessity. He spoke quietly into the receiver. This is 007 speaking. This is an open line. It's an emergency. Can you hear me? Pass this on at once. 3030 was a double, working for Redland. Yes, damn it. I said she was a double. The bitch is dead now. Ian Fleming, Casino Royale, 1953. I'm going to watch all 3 movies this weekend, and let's talk about this on Monday, if you feel like being tasked with doing the same. That was fun.